Welcome, everyone, to episode 9 of our COVID-19 Religion and Belief webinar series. Today, just a second, here we go. Today, we have a panel of all Asia-based experts, chaired by Professor Scharffs, Director of the Brigham Young University's International Center for Law and Religion Studies. You should have received their bios prior to this call. Today, our panel will cover about 14 time zones, from 7:30 a.m. in Provo, Utah to 9 p.m. in Singapore. And so thank you very much for making yourself available at such inconvenient times, but we will surely be appreciating the panel today. I invite all panelists and participants to respond to the poll that you see on your screen right now. It will give you and our speaker an idea of our global audience. Thank you very much. For your information, this webinar is being recorded and live streamed on social media. The recording will be available on our series landing page, where we also publish information about upcoming episodes, and you can see the link in the chat box. Also, you can type, and you're welcome to do so, your questions or upvote other people's questions anytime using the Q&A tool on the bottom of your screen. Please keep your text short and to the point, making it easier for the moderators to pass them on. If you get disconnected, just use the link you have received when you registered to join back in. Finally, I would like to recognize the sponsoring institutions of this webinar series: the Cambridge Institute on Religion and International Studies, the Center for Religious Studies at Bruno Kessler Foundation, the Center for Justice and Society at Fundação Getúlio Vargas Law School of Rio de Janeiro, the International Center for Law and Religion Studies at Brigham Young University Law School, the European Union Office of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and the University of Siena. I will now broadcast the results of the live poll and give the floor to Professor Scharffs. Professor Scharffs, time is yours.
Thank you, Francesco. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. I say good morning because it's 7 a.m. here in Provo, and welcome wherever you are joining us from around the world today. Our focus in this episode will be COVID-19 and its implications in Asia. This is a big area, both geographically and in terms of population. More than half of the people on Earth are in Asia. And so we will only be able to scratch the surface in the hour we have together. But I hope it will be informative and productive. We are joined by 3 distinguished experts, each of whom I'm grateful to also count as a friend. Dr. Jaclyn is Associate Professor of Law at the National University of Singapore and the Director of the NUS Center for Asian Legal Studies. She specializes in constitutional law as well as law and religion. Dr. Dicky Sofjan is a member of the core doctoral faculty of the Indonesian Consortium for Religious Studies, centered at the Graduate School of Universitas Gadjah Mada in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. His main teaching and research areas include religion, politics, and democracy. And Professor Faizan Mustafa is the Vice Chancellor of Nalsar University of Law in Hyderabad, India. Nalsar is an acronym standing for the National Academy of Legal Studies and Research, which is one of the leading national law universities located in Hyderabad. For those of us from places not as large as India, it's hard to imagine the size and scale of an entire university devoted entirely to the study of law. My hope today is that we can structure our webinar mostly as a discussion with responses from each of our panelists to a number of questions, including questions that have been submitted by participants in advance, as well as questions submitted during this hour together. To begin with, I'd like to invite everyone who is participating in our audience today to use the Q&A link to tell us what time of day it is where you are. I think we probably have a pretty broad global participation in our webinar today. So if you'd like, feel free to use the Q&A link to tell us what time it is. In the meantime, I'd like to begin by asking a personal question to each of our panelists. What has life been like for you over the last 4 to 5 months? And what is the current situation? How has the COVID crisis touched your lives? Professor Neo, may I begin with you?
Sure. Hi everyone. I can't really say good morning or good evening since there are so many of us from so many time zones, but thank you for participating in this webinar, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to be part of this. How has life been? So I think it's important to note that Singapore was actually one of the first few countries to have been hit by this sort of COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, when Singapore started putting in measures to deal with the pandemic, really, the disease wasn't even called COVID-19. So we've been dealing with this since January, so to speak. But initially, because the cases were very low and the government was very proactive in tracing, isolating, and testing, basically for a while, life was actually quite normal. But this changed in March, and since the end of March, towards the end of March, the cases started rising. And so we've been told to move all our classes online. We've been told to sort of work from home. And since April the 3rd, school has been closed, which makes working from home very difficult since children are at home at the same time. So we've only recently, just this week, opened schools again in stages. And we've sort of moved out of what we call the circuit breaker. It's not a lockdown, it's a circuit breaker. So there were 2 months of these restrictions in place where you're only supposed to go out for essential services. You're not supposed to have gatherings, and the campus is basically closed. So at this point in time, we are being allowed slowly to go back to the campus, and we have instituted a system whereby you can go back once a week, depending on the last digit of your staff card number. So that's where we are. Schools are opening, workplaces are opening, but it would be a gradual easing of restrictions.
Thank you. It's interesting to see some of these innovative ways of responding specifically. I like the 1 day a week with the last day of your ID number. It makes social distancing, physical distancing is a term I like better, a little more feasible. Dr. Sofjan, Dicky, tell us a little bit about what you've been experiencing over the last few months in Yogyakarta.
Well, thank you very much, Brad, for the introduction. I'm always very happy to engage you and the team at Brigham Young. Well, life has been somewhat abnormal for me, at least for the past 2.5 months now. I mean, I remember in February, I was still globetrotting and visiting Abu Dhabi and attending the World Urban Forum where there was 18,000 people in attendance, but suddenly when I came back, things sort of changed a lot. And obviously after the policy on what we call PSBB, which is a large-scale social restriction policy from the government, everything sort of was turned upside down. And as we know, not long after that, we had the holy month of Ramadan. For 1 whole month, we were fasting, within the confines of our own homes. And obviously, this is the first time for me in my entire life to ever experience Ramadan this way, so I didn't really hear much of the activities in the mosques or even the Quranic recitations coming from the loudspeakers from the mosques, And right after that, obviously we celebrated the Eid al-Fitr, the Hari Raya, and that too was subdued, and many of the towns and cities and municipalities and even villages were locked down, by the residents for fear of, people coming in from the outside. So it's kind of a sad occasion for us because, Eid al-Fitr was supposed to be a celebration, right after the, month of Ramadan. So, it's kind of, it's a different kind of feeling. It's a strange kind of feeling, that I'm feeling right now, but the university has also been closed down since the third week of March. So we've been working from home and having, online teachings. And I think many have resorted, including myself, to, gardening and planting some seeds and various kinds of vegetables at home.
I like that. For religious traditions where pilgrimages are an important part of religious life, it's been really, as you know, very disruptive to see the limitations on travel to Mecca, for example, and certainly Ramadan, even as a non-Muslim viewing it from the outside, it's clear that it was very different this year. Dr. Faizan Mustafa, our Vice Chancellor from NALSAR, thank you so much. We're glad you're with us. We've begun, Dr. Mustafa, with just a question about how the COVID crisis has touched your life personally. What has life been like there in Hyderabad for the last 3 or 4 months?
Many thanks, Brett, and wonderful seeing you online. For a president of a university, it's a bad time because you have to take care of all the students and non-teaching staff and your outsourced employees, many of them who cannot work, but you have to ensure that they are paid their salaries. So personally, it has been really very, very taxing. As you know, you have been on our campus, that I live on campus. So while others are in lockdown, working or not really working with the same kind of working hours, as someone on the ground, I had to do the entire administrative work of the university. There have been, questions about how to conduct exam. And in India, unlike in the West, we have issues of access. Many of my students are in remote, in rural areas where even telephone is not working. Some of them are in Kashmir who do not, even after 10 months, have 4G connection. So they are with 2G connection. And then we have been, experimenting with number of things, Cisco's, Webimax, so we can have a phone-in facility. So it was difficult to, eventually complete our classes. And then we tried to send DVDs to those students who were not online. And finally, as we could not conduct the exam, we had to scale up their marks of the internals so that we can graduate the outgoing batch. And now again, we have a challenge for the new semester. But this lockdown, which happened in India, as you know, suddenly at 4 hours notice, has really convinced me that we need to thank God all the time, because millions of poor migrant laborers are on Indian roads without food, without water. Many of them have died on their ways back home. So I think as member of a faith community, we do not really thank God enough for all the privileges we have. So personally, it has been a new kind of experience. My family members say that you have never been around, in the house for so long. As you know, I returned from Harvard only on 19th of Feb. So it has been almost, 3 months or so that I haven't gone out of my house. But managing universities where you have in a society a lot of inequalities, reaching out to all your students is really difficult. And convincing, for instance, construction of 3 huge buildings is going on. My contractor was not willing to pay wages to the laborers who are not working all these days. So a lot of persuasion and some kind of even financial help. And then our university students also raised some money. We also helped some of the migrant workers. We hired buses for them so that they can reach home.
Oh, hearing that description, Faizan, makes the rest of us grateful for our own plight. That is a really bracing set of challenges you're facing. And one of the most remarkable things is you're somehow focusing on gratitude at a time when it would be easy to be focusing on anything but gratitude. Our hearts are very much with you. Let me add a personal note as well. One of the things that has been so devious about this pandemic is that the virus is transmitted easily, including by those with no symptoms. And many people get sick, but in very moderate degrees. Some don't even know they've been infected. And yet for some people, especially those who are elderly with pre-existing conditions, it's horrendous. We have an advisory board at our center, and one of our good friends who's on the executive committee of our advisory board contracted the COVID virus, got very sick, spent 3 weeks on a respirator. We thought he was getting better, and eventually he lost his battle and he died. And it's a really important reminder that behind all of these statistics and all of these numbers lie individual human beings and the families that love them. And it's so interesting. I mean, like I say, it's diabolical that this disease touches us equally in some sense, but in such different ways in terms of the impact and the ramifications. And so one thing I've really appreciated about this series of webinars is just the opportunity to get a glimpse of what it's like in the lives of people in different places and what we're doing in our various ways to try to respond to the challenges that we're facing. Let me ask a question and go in reverse order. So Faizan, let me start with you. How has the COVID crisis specifically affected religious communities in your countries and even beyond? If you'd like to speak more broadly, Asia, of course, is a big region. We don't have someone representing most of the countries in Asia. But just briefly, what has life been like for religious communities? Dicky, you touched on this a little bit, but let me give each of you an opportunity just to give us a little bit of a feel for that.
Thank you, Brett. You see, strangely, as some of the governments were slow to react, in India, we got the first case on 30th Jan, and then we welcomed your president in a big way in Namaste India program. While he was here in February, all our energies went in and were used in welcoming United States president. So
well, just filling the stadium was quite a task.
Yes. And Gujarat, where that stadium is in now terrible state. So what really happened that we started reacting at the governmental level as late as 3rd week of March. And then suddenly, when government was feeling the heat of not preparing itself well in advance, because we did not really ban international travel. I myself traveled on 19th February, as I told you, from Boston, and nobody tested me anything, at the airport. I, very easily came out of airport. Then suddenly, as they are called travelers in faith, there is a Muslim sect called Tablighi Jamaat. Now these people are absolutely non-political. There have been intelligence reports that these people don't talk of this word. They are either talking of what will happen to us in our graves, or they are talking of heaven or hell. So what will happen after we are dead? But this group, they have their headquarters in Delhi, and on a daily basis, they receive about 200 people from all over the world. So when national lockdown happened, in compliance with law, they did not allow anybody to get out. And by 28th of March or 29th of March, when they went to the police and they said, we have these many people, including some foreigners, you arrange buses for us, we have arranged you arrange passes for us. We have arranged the buses and the drivers and the conductors. The police did not come forward for help. And then suddenly, in the entire media, it was presented as if it was a corona jihad. It was some kind of deliberate, intentional move of these people to spread coronavirus, and all our energies for almost a month were wasted in demonizing these people. We do not know how many of them were tested, how many of them tested positive, but subsequently the news which came in some secular media houses was that many of these people are donating their plasma so that people who are now getting infected can be cured. But the way this whole episode was played out in Indian media, this small group of Muslims, they were taken as the entire Muslim community. The entire community was blamed. The Muslims were really at the receiving end, and subsequently many foreigners who were there, they have been put in jail. Many of them are still in detention. Recently I was reading a bail order from a Bombay court saying that how can you put charges of culpable homicide against these people who have themselves tested negative that they are spreading coronavirus. So I feel that for the faith community, it has been a terrible time. I take another example. You referred to pilgrims to Mecca. For 6 Sardars, we have the 3rd holiest place in Maharashtra called Nanded, and some 406 were stranded there. And when they subsequently, after a month or so, went back to Punjab, again they were called super spreaders of coronavirus. We had similarly some Hindu pilgrims stranded in some of the Hindu shrines. For them, luxury buses were arranged, and the media really did not play out. As you know, a number of places in United States, some Jews were blamed. In France, some Christian sects were blamed. In South Africa also, some of the churches were blamed. Yeah. But that is how the religious communities are all about, that these people go to their God, all the more when they are in problem, because they think that they will get their salvation and help and cure from the God.
Yeah. One thing that
Yeah, so the way governments and more than government, media irresponsibly reacted against faith communities and faiths is really not fair. I will just take one more example. You know, as Dicky was telling about Indonesia, here also all religious places were subsequently closed. So in no mosque any Ramadan prayer was really performed, but the muazzin who makes a call for prayer, he is not going to infect anybody. He lives in the mosque. So in number of towns in Uttar Pradesh and even in Delhi, police did not allow even giving of azan or this call for the prayer, even though, you know, the Muslims in the Muslim countries, you must have heard, have changed their azan, where, you know, instead of saying that come for prayer to the house of God, it says pray at home and stay safe. But still that call for prayer was not given. And recently, you know, a dean of a medical college in countries leading medical college was found in a viral video that she is saying that why are we wasting our kits and our medicines on these faith communities, you know, specifically referring to this travelers in faith or Tablighi Jamaat. These people should all be put in jail. So, yeah. We saw that there was some kind of, you know, revulsion against all religions, but it was very, very particular about Islam, and all Muslims were treated as Tablighi Jamaat. You know, Muslims is a huge community. Yeah. It has number of sects. I don't think even 5% of Indian Muslims may be Tablighi Jamaatis. And these people did not do it intentionally. When there was a lockdown, they got stranded there. So they did not have any intention to be there.
So you raise a couple really important points. One is this problem of scapegoating, which we've noticed around the world. You mentioned the Hasidic Jews in New York, the experience of the religious community in South Korea near the beginning of the pandemic. There does seem to be something about wanting to blame the other that comes out in a very big way during these moments. One thing that I found interesting is that in the US media, if there's a contagion cluster or a hot spot in a church, it's treated like some sort of a pathology or a major crisis. But if the cluster is in a health club or in a conference meeting of scientists, it's just treated as an ordinary public health problem that needs to be managed sensibly. And it's sort of interesting. It tells us a lot about ourselves, about our media, how differently we react to situations like this. The other thing I think is interesting is your comment about the scope of limitations. Sometimes some limitations are really necessary, but others may not be necessary. And the call to prayer is a good example. If you're in your place of residence, prohibiting you to use the loudspeaker sounds overbroad. It sounds like a typical overstep of authority. And I think it's quite common for legal authorities to identify good reasons for limitation, health and safety, but then to go further than is necessary in implementing those. Let me ask everyone to respond briefly so we can get through a number of questions. I see questions streaming in as well. Dicky, tell us a little bit about the experience of religious communities that you've observed in Indonesia.
Yeah, I think we are all now too familiar with the pictures of houses of worships being closed down or having no congregational members, you know, with the mosque, churches and synagogues and so on. I think we've seen them all. And I think that most of the Indonesian Muslims have also seen the holy, grand mosques in Mecca and Medina also closing. And as you correctly pointed out, you know, the Indonesian government had just announced that we will not be sending any pilgrims for the Hajj, for the major pilgrimage this year. So obviously there'll be certainly repercussions, you know, with respect to that kind of religious observance. I'm seeing a lot of congruence with what the professor was saying in India with respect to the Tablighi Jama'ah, because we've also seen the same kind of phenomenon in Indonesia and Malaysia as well. And there have been pretty much a focus in the past few weeks now due to the worldwide gatherings in Goa, in Sulawesi, and in Selangor in Malaysia. And so what we are seeing is that there is this sort of a phenomenon of religious phobia. In a way, you know, sort of pointing the fingers to these religious communities, saying essentially that they are intellectually deficient, that they are religiously ignorant, or, you know, religiously arrogant, and so on. And obviously, we do find some of these religious people having those traits and characteristics. I mean, we've heard some of the lamentations by some religious people saying that, you know, God is greater than coronavirus, or our faith is stronger than COVID-19, and so on and so forth. I think we've heard the same kind of thing from some of the Christian, especially the charismatic Christians in the US, for instance. Now, with respect to Indonesia, you know, in Indonesia, we have the Majlis Ulama, and that's the Council of the Religious Scholars. And they came up with a fatwa, a legal opinion or ruling, to recommend and advise Muslims not to pray in the mosques. And so there was a fatwa which essentially advised Muslim to avoid going to mosques for the 5 obligatory prayers, for the Friday congregational prayers, and also for the night prayers during Ramadan, and including the Eid al-Fitr congregational prayer. And so, I think for the most part, the Indonesian Muslims sort of heeded to that advice. And most of us had spent our prayers and supplications at home. And some have even engaged in incantations and doing the salawat, praising the Holy Prophet of Muhammad as a protection from this pandemic. And so we are seeing a lot of religious activism as well on the other part, because we've seen organizations like the Muhammadiyah, for instance, which has been very actively involved in providing, charity and food donations, to the poor and disadvantaged. But also, a lot of research has been done as well by various of these organizations, including the Ministry of Religious Affairs, who has spent some amount of money, to do some basic research on how the COVID-19 has influenced religious communities around Indonesia. Now, obviously, with the large-scale social restriction policies of the state, we have seen, as I mentioned, the online religious observance and the online religious gatherings and religious discussions and so on. So we are seeing a new type of religiosity, if you like, or a new type of religious practice in a way due to this pandemic. And I'm seeing that perhaps this might lead to something else, you know, in terms of how people see themselves and their religious identity and rituals and practices and so on. So, you know, there's so many things that need to be reflected on, and I don't think we have sufficient sort of wisdom of hindsight, you know, to sort of clearly see things through.
Thank you, Dicky. I appreciate your focusing on the fatwa and the advice from the religious authorities of how to respond appropriately, and also highlighting the charitable activities of religious groups. In a few weeks, we'll have a webinar focusing specifically on that topic. And it's something that I hope does not get lost in the commotion of this crisis is the very creative and constructive ways that so many religious communities are responding, usually in the small places of the world, neighbor to neighbor, and in communities. A lot of that work gets overseen. I've seen in our own neighborhood, neighbors taking care of each other and reaching out, especially to older residents who really should be at home, helping them with everything from shopping to helping take care of making sure they have their medicines and things like this. I think these times really do bring out the best and the worst in us, and it's nice to recognize some of the best that gets that happens as well. Jaclyn, we've really watched with interest Singapore's response. It seems extremely effective, perhaps a little heavy-handed. Perhaps the response to the immigrant groups has seemed a little heavy, but for the most part, we've been really impressed, those observing from afar, with the organization and the skill and the thoughtfulness of what's been happening. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've seen in religious communities in particular, in how they've responded to the situation?
Yes, thank you, Brett. Just to sort of give a little background to those who may not be entirely familiar with Singapore. Obviously, Singapore is a small island state. It has a sort of resident population of 5.3 million people. So I think that's important to give the perspective, because it is sort of a densely populated city-state. So the way in which Singapore manages its the COVID-19 outbreak may be sort of different from how Indonesia would be able to manage it, because Indonesia has so many islands, so many people, and so on. But I think what is also very specific about Singapore is the fact that this is a highly diverse society in terms of religion. There's no single religion that is in the majority. Now, I say this because if we look at the period in which various restrictions have come in place, the period in which religious communities have been affected, several sort of major festivals have come and gone, right? So there was Easter Sunday where churches were affected. There was Idul Fitri. In addition, there was a sort of a Chinese festival called Qingming, as well as the Hindu New Year. So these are sort of the festivals that came and went during the period of time when control measures were in place. And so the sense is that that religious communities, several religious communities are affected. Now, I think it's important to note a few things. The first is that when mosques and churches and temples started to sort of go online, this was actually done voluntarily, meaning it was done before the control measures were put in place. And sort of, as I mentioned, the sort of initial restrictions actually came towards the end of March, where the government sort of said that communal activities have to be limited. But before the end of March, several religious groups, the Catholic Church was actually one of the first to close, to say that we will move online. It suspended weekday and weekend public masses as early as 14 February, meaning a whole month before the government put in measures, right? And similarly, in, the one of the mega churches in Singapore, I think this is quite important, that this is not just a denominational church reacting in this way, but one of the mega churches actually also moved their services online, and subsequently the Anglican parish as well. And the mosque closure really also came in on the after several congregants tested positive after having attended a Tabligh Jamaat gathering in KL. So they closed the mosque initially temporarily for cleaning, and but subsequently this was extended after control measures came in place. So I think the voluntariness of that closure is important. The initial voluntariness of that closure is important. And the second point I wanted to make is why. The question of why there was this voluntary closure is also very important. The discourse has been that we as religious leaders have to be responsible. We as religious leaders have a responsibility to our members to ensure their health and safety. So for instance, the Catholic Church, when they first announced the suspension of the mass, they said that, we have to play our part in being responsible. They also sort of emphasized that and the churches that also moved their services online also said that we have members who are young and old, we have vulnerable members among our midst, and it is our responsibility to them to move our services online in order not to place them at greater risk. Interestingly, going back to Dicky's point, there was also a fatwa that actually talked about the permissibility of suspending Friday congregational prayers, as well as closing of mosques in the interest of public safety and health. In addition to responsibility to members, another important part of the discourse was our responsibility to the community. And so again, the Catholic Church, when they initially suspended Mass and then decided to continue to suspend Mass, said that as responsible Catholics, we should be mindful that we do not do anything that might further burden the already strained healthcare system. And further, the Archbishop said that as the head of the Catholic Church, I have to decide for the common good. So the discourse is very much not just that we have responsibilities towards our members, we also have responsibilities to the community. And I think thirdly is something that Dicky also mentioned, which is this emphasis on spirituality. So this move from orthopraxy to orthodoxy, this move from the emphasis on community worship, communal worship, which is not entirely sort of ignored, but the emphasis in the discourse has been that it is unfortunate that we cannot congregate, but religion, our religion is more than that. And so the Mufti, for instance, when issued a statement for Ramadan, which urged Muslims to reflect on the core idea of Ramadan, emphasizes the spiritual aspect, where he says, if you strip the month of all additional activities, you will find that it is essentially about the act of fasting and the act of helping the poor and the vulnerable, and that these are the pillars of Islam, and we should be grateful that we can still perform these pillars. So those are sort of the that has become a significant part of the discourse.
Yeah, thank you, Jaclyn. That's really interesting. To me, it's really notable how easily the mindset shifts to the notion of responsibility, of religious leaders wanting to be responsible, not only to their own congregants, but to the society at large. You know, we in the West, I think it's a stereotype, but we begin speaking so immediately in terms of rights. But I think in many places, including the United States, it has been interesting to see the response of religious communities being ahead of the response of public authorities. It's really interesting that there were these voluntary closures taking place before they became mandatory. It also suggests that perhaps speaking in terms of guidelines and instruction rather than mandates can be a strategy that can be utilized. You know, I think most people are willing to listen to appeals. Certainly when we began sheltering in place here in the United States, it was largely to protect the health system from being overwhelmed quickly, to protect the most vulnerable from getting infected. There was a lot of other regard that was at the heart of it, but as it drags on, it becomes more difficult to sustain that feeling of other regard, and it tends to begin to fray nerves and fray social fabric. It's been interesting in the United States, for example, to see how differently different groups, political persuasions have responded to different types of non-compliance. Those who were non-compliant because they were protesting wanting to return to work, protesting the severity of the prohibitions, were broadly condemned by many in media, who are now praising mass gatherings, who are protesting the racial incident of George Floyd, the killing of George Floyd that happened here in the United States. So I think all of this tests us. It tests whether we're willing to treat similar situations similarly, whether we're willing to make relevant distinctions where relevant distinctions are necessary. But I really like this emphasis on the voluntary as opposed to the mandated, and also the sense of responsibility. You know, the Bible, for example, is not a book that talks about rights. It is a book that talks about duties. And so it's an ethic of duty rather than an ethic of right that emerges from the Hebrew Bible, from the Old Testament. And so it may be natural for faith leaders, even in places like the West, to lead a discourse that focuses on responsibilities and love as opposed to just rights and freedoms. We have time, I think, for one more topic, and I want to raise the issue of nationalism. This came up in a question submitted from Mongolia. There is sort of a impulse there to, as the questioner describes it, favor traditional religions such as shamanism and Buddhism, and to dismiss non-Mongolian faith traditions like Christianity and others. Professor Neo, you and I have been working on a project for a couple of years thinking about nationalism in Asia. We've had a number of conferences and journal series articles that have been written about this. I'm interested in thinking a little bit about how the currents of nationalism have been amplified or distorted or changed with respect to the COVID crisis. And Faisal, let me start with you, and then Dicky, let me ask you to respond, and then Jaclyn, I'll give you the last word. This, of course, Faisal, is something that we've been worried about in India, and that you talked a little bit about in your focusing on how Muslim groups have been scapegoated and targeted for blame. But can you say a word about the larger currents of nationalism and how you see the COVID crisis touching that? And also how that nationalism relates to religion. We have a sense in India, for example, that the nationalism that we see is closely associated with a variety of Hinduism that is prominent.
Thank you, Brett. For almost a decade or so, but particularly in last 6-7 years, when you have a Hindu nationalist party in power with a massive majority, and the Prime Minister is hugely popular. Last year, he won his second tenure. So lately, this narrow nationalism, aggressive nationalism, has been the subject of intense debate in the country. And allow me to say that because of this narrow nationalism and symbolism, we passed last year a very regressive law where we said that people who from certain countries, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh, whom we will give our citizenship, we named 6 religions and excluded Judaism and Islam. And then there were huge protests whole of December, whole of January, until this COVID crisis came in. And the whole argument of that India is a country for Hindus who treat it both as their motherland as well as their pious land. Now, this whole idea, it excludes religions like Judaism, like Christianity, like Islam, whose pious lands are either in Palestine or in Saudi Arabia, isn't so? This whole idea of exclusion in the name of this narrow nationalism is having an effect. And as I said, media is contributing to this polarization and this divide. Lately, what is happening, that when countries are saying that we will just take care of our people, and if they define their people that narrowly, then you have, for instance, there was an advertisement given by a hospital, leading hospital, saying we will not admit Muslim patients. So if this nationalism reaches this kind of madness, then of course the idea of civic nationalism, which our constitution talked about, is lost. I think, as you rightly said, all religions, and in COVID-19, instead of emphasizing rituals in religions, now when people are not having congregations and they are having individual prayers, and this individual is directly in contact with his or her God, I think they need to reflect on this, that all religions are all about humanity. In Islam, it is said that the best pilgrimage is not to go to Mecca, but to win the heart of a fellow human being. If we cannot come forward, millions of these migrant people, starving people, who are walking on our roads back home, and there were no trains for them, no buses for them. Many of them in their testimonies have said that we could survive because it was a month of Ramadan and Muslims came forward and gave their zakat and arranged food for them. So I think that there is a lesson for the religions, that they need to look beyond their immediate faith community. And I feel that this whole idea of narrow nationalism in COVID-19 situation, if you look at some of the economic packages which have been announced, we are going in the direction of protectionism rather than free trade. So we will survive and everybody else in the world will survive. So I don't think that this is the time to put trade barriers. This is the time to help each other. Our government helped United States when United States required chloroquine hydrochloride. It was a huge cargo which went from India. We are also helping certain other countries with PPEs and the N95 mask. But I personally feel that idea of nationalism is a new idea. It is a 19th century European idea. And this is not an idea of universalism or idea of all human beings are equal and all human beings are brothers. So I think
we're short of time, Dr. Mustafa, so I'm sorry to cut you short. I think the worries we have about nationalism is something we'll watch closely in India. I like how you, like Dr. Neo, were really focusing on the essential elements of our faith traditions. I think this crisis is giving those of us who are religious, those of us for whom our religious identity is important to us, an opportunity to reflect hard on what is most essential and most important. Dicky, let me ask you to reflect for a moment on nationalism and religion in the COVID moment. I am thinking about this with respect to Indonesia, of course, from the Muslim perspective rather than the Hindu perspective.
Well, thank you, Brett. Well, at the initial phase of the pandemic, I guess around February and March, one could see a lot of statements coming out from Indonesian high-ranking officials and also social and religious leaders saying essentially that Indonesia might actually be spared from this pandemic, given that we have the strength of our bodies, we have our jamu, our traditional herbal medicines and healthy dietary patterns and so on and so forth. I mean, that kind of rhetoric did come out for a couple of weeks, for a few weeks rather, just before we had the first cases of the COVID-19. And as we are, as we increasingly realize that we weren't spared from the pandemic, that Indonesians were also being affected by this virus, that we started to see these rhetorics, to decrease quite significantly. But we are not seeing the kind of propaganda or statements coming from Donald Trump, for instance, saying that this coronavirus is a Chinese virus and what have you. But then there was this incident, during the, I think, patient number 1 in Indonesia, where it was said that this virus was contracted from a Japanese national or somebody who had come from Japan. I mean, that some of the Japanese people and the Japanese government, in fact, they lodged a protest quietly to the Indonesian government for stressing and emphasizing that the patient number 1 was in fact a Japanese. And so there was that kind of rhetoric during the initial phase. But I think for in the Indonesian context, we need to realize that there are secular nationalists and there are also the religious nationalists, and I think the responses are quite different. Yeah, but I'm not seeing a lot of scapegoating. I think there's a lot of reflections coming in from especially the president and the top-ranking officials, and especially those who are in charge of the task force. But as the professor from India was saying earlier, that social polarization has been on an increasing trend, especially in Indonesia, right after the presidential elections in 2014 and 2019. So if there are any sort of negative propaganda and rhetorics against what the government is doing right now in fighting the pandemic, you could see that this is still a leftover from the presidential elections in previous years.
Professor Neo, what are you observing about nationalism in the COVID moment?
So I'm going to focus on Singapore since that's the sort of jurisdiction that I followed most closely. I would say probably sort of two things. One is the government's response has been to emphasize the need for social solidarity among different groups. So there were sort of instances of what we call, well, racism, whereby, for instance, a religious, Islamic religious teacher actually posted something saying that, oh, you know, this is a punishment for the way the Chinese treated the Muslims in China, and so on. And these types of statements, and then sort of vice versa, there were other statements as well. So these statements were quickly the government's response was very quick in saying that this is unacceptable. So in various sort of ministerial statements, the emphasis has been that we need to maintain that the COVID-19 is not based on nationality, race, language, or religion. It doesn't respect borders or territories. We need to help each other. So the sort of state response has always been, this is crucial. We need to stay together and keep together in order to deal with this this outbreak. Now, the second thing I wanted to sort of mention is the interfaith or multi-faith response, which is that there has been a very explicit show of sort of collective sacrifice and collective solidarity. And you see this, for instance, when the Mufti wrote an open letter to the National Council of Churches expressing solidarity that they had to celebrate Easter Sunday online. So respecting that, sort of in his letter, he talked about how our respective traditions empower us with meaning, values, and lessons. And similarly for Eid, the Catholic Church also responded with a sort of congratulatory letter showing solidarity that they had to celebrate Hari Raya, Eid al-Fitr online and not in person. So you see this sort of discourse and about how I recognize your sacrifice and you recognize my sacrifice, and that we are in this collective effort together.
It takes a lot of effort to be mindful of each other and to be aware of each other's different situations. I want to thank our panelists. I wish we had additional time and we could go on. Thank you for joining us at inconvenient hours and in very busy and stressful situations in which you each find yourself. Francesco, let me turn it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Brett. Thank you for being with us today. Let's give a virtual round of applause to our panel and the hosts who made this panel possible. It has been a very interesting discussion, and I would like to thank our chair and panelists for their contributions. Thank you, the participants, for joining us from many places, and we appreciate your engagement and participation as well. Now, I'm happy to announce our next webinar. Registration on our landing page is open for episode 10 next week, 11th of June at 3 p.m. Brussels time. This webinar will be in partnership with the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, and will focus on COVID-19, freedom of religion or belief, and gender. We will be joined by Dr. Ahmed Shahid, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, and by members of the OSCE ODIHR panel of experts on freedom of religion or belief. We hope you will be able to join us. Although we cannot see you, we appreciate your support throughout the series, and we look forward to welcoming you next Thursday. Have a wonderful day, and thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.